She had come 300 miles for a housekeeping job, not a husband. But when the wind slammed the door shut behind her and the rancher spoke, he didn't offer her a room in the back or a wage by the week. He told her the only place on his land safe enough for a widow carrying a dead man's debt and a town's whispers was beside him, wearing his name, sharing his fire, daring anyone who rode onto Tongue River to say otherwise. What began as a bargain to save 640 acres before the snow came would become the truest promise either of them had ever kept. Naomi Reeves had traveled 300 miles on the strength of 4 sentences in a newspaper. Wanted, capable woman for ranch work, cooking, keeping house, wages paid. Inquire Tongue River Ranch, Miles City. She had read those words so many times on the stage from Kansas that she could have recited them in her sleep. She needed them to be true. She had $11 left, a dead husband's debt following her like a shadow, and nowhere in Abilene that would still call itself home. The ranch house sat low and square against the evening light, a rider's shape moving between the barn and the corral. Naomi knocked. The door opened on a man built like fence posts, tall, unhurried, a ledger still open on the table behind him, columns of numbers in a tight, worried hand. "I answered your advertisement," she said. "Naomi Reeves. I cook, I clean, I've nursed livestock. I'll work hard for fair wages." Silas Boone looked at her the way a mofter looks at a debt he cannot pay. Not unkind, just tired past the point of pretending. "There's no wages here, Mrs. Reeves. Not this year." He stepped back enough that she could see the ledger, red ink bleeding through the page. "Banks owed, counties owed, and in 30 days a man from the land office rides out here to decide if I keep this claim or lose it. Then you don't need a housekeeper." "No." He said it plainly, the way he likely said everything. "The claim reads a family has to work this land, so man, wife, roof over both their heads, proof of it. My wife's been gone 8 months. I can hire hands for the cattle. I can't hire a wife." He studied her a long moment, the calluses on her hands, the set of her jaw, the way she hadn't flinched at his bluntness. "I'm not asking what you think I'm asking. I need a woman willing to marry a stranger, sign her name where the county can see it, and stay long enough to make it true on paper. In trade, you'd have a roof no one can take from you, and a name no man in Abilene can follow." "What happened to your wife?" Naomi asked. She needed to know what kind of grief she'd be walking into before she agreed to stand inside it. "Charlotte died bringing our son into the world last spring. Boy didn't live a day past her." Silas's voice didn't rise or crack, but something behind his eyes went to stone. "I don't talk on it beyond that. I won't ask again." She meant it. She understood a wound that wanted covering, not prodding at. "Any children of your own?" he asked, matching her question with one of his. "No. 11 years married and none came. I buried Elias in Abilene and left with what I could carry on my back." Something passed between them then. Not sympathy, Silas didn't strike her as a man given easily to sympathy, but a kind of recognition. 2 people who'd learned the same hard lessons in different graveyards. Heat rose in Naomi's face. Not shame, but the old fury of being sized up and priced. "I didn't come here to be bought, Mr. Boone. Didn't offer to buy you. Offered you the one thing I've got that's worth anything. My name and a claim to stand behind it." His voice didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. Woman traveling alone with a debt on her back needs a wall around her. I need a wife on paper before the snow. Seemed to me those two needs might shake hands. She should have turned around, should have walked back into the wind and found some other door. But her last coin had bought this stage fare, and behind her lay a town that had already decided what a black widow with a dead man's debt deserved. And if I refuse? Then I wish you well, and you're welcome to sleep in the barn tonight before you go on wherever it is you're going. No threat in it, just fact. And once your claim is settled, what happens to us then? That's your choice to make when the time comes. I won't hold a woman to a bargain past what it was meant to protect her from. He said it without softening, but there was no trap hidden in it either, and Naomi found she believed him more for the plainness of it than any promise dressed up prettier would have earned. Naomi looked past him into the house. A cold hearth, an apron still hanging on its peg, a home built by hands that had stopped moving 8 months ago. She thought of the man in Abilene who came around asking after her husband's debt with a smile that never reached his eyes. She thought of $11. I want a night to think on it, she said. Something in his face eased, not quite relief. Fair enough. Spare room's got a bed and a working latch on the door. You'll lock it yourself if it eases your mind. She almost smiled at that. The first true courtesy he'd offered, tucked inside a sentence about locks. It might. He stood aside. Naomi crossed the threshold into the dim, close warmth of a house that had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to decide it was still worth saving. Behind her, the door shut against the cold. Ahead of her, a ledger full of debts that were not her own, and a decision that would either save her or bind her to a stranger's ruin. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the low fire turning the newspaper advertisement over in her hands until the print blurred, weighing a stranger's bargain against a town that had already made its judgment of her. By morning, she had her answer, though she did not yet know if it was courage or simply the last door left open. Naomi woke before first light, from habit more than rest. She found the kitchen exactly as she remembered it from the hallway the night before, untouched, as if time itself had stopped the day Charlotte Boone died. A faded blue apron hung on a peg by the stove. A sewing basket sat half-finished beside the window, a shirt collar still pinned mid-stitch. She was still standing there when Silas came in from the barn, hat in hand. He saw where she was looking and stopped. "You don't have to answer today," he said. "I already have." Naomi turned to face him squarely. "I'll marry you, Mr. Boone, but not as a hired woman standing in for your wife's ghost. If I carry your name, I want a say in this kitchen, this garden, and how this house is run. I won't be paid in silence." He didn't answer right away. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, a horse stamped in the cold. "Never asked for silence," he said finally. "Charlotte kept her own accounts on the kitchen and never asked me twice about it. Same terms stand for you." "And her things?" Naomi nodded at the apron. "I won't throw out what isn't mine to throw. Wear what's useful. Leave what isn't ready to be moved." His jaw tightened briefly. "I'll know the difference when I see it." It was as much tenderness as the man seemed to allow himself, and Naomi understood then that grief lived in this house the way dust lives in a shuttered room, not gone, only waiting for someone to open a window. She took the apron from its peg, turned it over once in her hands, and hung it back exactly where it had been. Then she took a clean one from her own bag and tied it at her waist instead. Silas watched that small decision without comment, but something shifted in his shoulders, as if a weight he hadn't named had eased a fraction. "Coffee's on," he said, nodding toward the pot. It was the closest thing to a peace offering he seemed to know how to make. She poured 2 cups. When she handed him his, their hands brushed, his rough with rope burn and rain leather, hers marked from years of her own work. Neither pulled away too quickly. Neither lingered either. It was, Naomi thought, exactly the kind of touch 2 strangers bargaining for survival might allow themselves. Brief, deliberate, honest. "There's a preacher in town does civil vows Thursdays," Silas said, setting his cup down. "Judge Harmon will do it faster if we need the paper signed sooner. Land office won't care which, only that it's recorded." "Thursday, then." Naomi kept her voice even, though her pulse was not. "I'll want witnesses who aren't strangers to me either, if I'm to have any standing in this town at all. Jesse'll stand for me, my brother." Silas paused. "There's a woman runs the mercantile, Odell. Sharp tongue, but fair. She might stand for you in time. Not yet." "Not yet," Naomi agreed. She understood the shape of the town before she'd even seen its main street. She'd read it in 100 towns before this one. She rose to look through the pantry, taking stock of what the house held, and found instead a drawer stuffed with unopened envelopes, bank notices, a lumber account past due, a letter from the county assessor. She laid them on the table without a word. Silas's jaw tightened. "Those aren't yours to sort through." "They are now, if I'm to keep this house running on what's left after the bank takes its share." Naomi opened the top envelope, scanned the figures, and set it down flat. "You've been letting these sit unopened. Didn't see the use in reading bad news twice. I'd rather read it once and know exactly how bad than be surprised by it later." She began sorting the stack into 2 piles. What could wait? What couldn't? "I kept Elias's books for 11 years. I won't let this house go under from neglect of its paper, same as its fences." He watched her work a moment, something unreadable crossing his face, then reached for his hat. "Lumber account can wait till spring. Banknotes due 1st of the month. I'll ride in Thursday, same day as the vows, and settle what I can. Then I'll have the numbers ready for you before you go." It was, Naomi thought, the first time since she'd arrived that she'd felt useful rather than merely tolerated, and the feeling settled into her chest like a small, steady fire. They ate a plain breakfast in a silence that was, for the first time, not entirely uncomfortable. When Silas rose to leave for the barn, he paused at the door. "I don't know how to make this easy on you, Mrs. Reeves." "You don't need to make it easy," Naomi said. "Just make it honest. I can manage the rest myself." He nodded once, the closest thing to agreement she had seen from him, and went out into the cold. Naomi stood a moment longer in the kitchen that would soon be half hers, her hand resting on the back of a chair worn smooth by another woman's years. She did not intend to erase what had been here before her. She intended only to prove that a house could hold more than one woman's care, if it was given the chance. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, she had swept the hearth, mended the stove's rusted damper, and set Charlotte's sewing basket carefully on a high shelf. Kept, not discarded. It was a small thing. It was also, Naomi understood, the first true decision of the marriage she had not yet made. The letter came by rider 3 days after the vows were signed before Judge Harmon. A plain civil ceremony. 4 witnesses, no flowers. Silas read it twice at the kitchen table, his face unreadable, before he set it down for Naomi to see. Custer County Land Office, Inspection of homestead claim number 4471, Boone, South. Scheduled 30 days hence. To confirm continuous family residency per Section 4 of the Act. 30 days, Naomi repeated. To prove we're a family that's been building a life here, not two strangers who signed a paper last week. 30 days, Silas agreed. Long enough, if nothing goes wrong. Something already had. Naomi had seen it herself that morning. The west fence line down near the creek, 3 posts snapped clean, as though pulled rather than fallen. She hadn't mentioned it yet. She mentioned it now. Silas's expression didn't change, but his hand went still on the table. That fence runs the border with Slade Cattle Company. You think it was deliberate? I think Everett Slade has wanted the water rights on this stretch of the Tongue River since before Charlotte and I filed the claim. And I think he knows exactly how many days I've got left to prove I'm still entitled to it. Silas stood, reaching for his coat. I'll ride the line, see what else is down. Naomi went with him. She had not asked. She simply took her shawl from the peg and followed him out to the horses, and he did not tell her to stay behind. They rode the fence together in the cold morning air, mostly silent, until they came upon a rider waiting near the break, a broad man on a big bay horse, unhurried, as if he had all the time in creation. Boone. Everett Slade tipped his hat, eyes sliding to Naomi with open appraisal. Heard you'd taken a wife. Didn't think you'd manage it so quick, given the circumstances. Fences down on my side, Slade. Cattle wander. Fences fall. Happens. Slade's smile didn't reach his eyes. County's sending a man out to look at your claim soon, I hear. Shame if the place didn't look lived in enough to satisfy him. It'll satisfy him. Silas's voice was flat, final. This is my wife, Naomi Boone. She'll be standing right here when your inspector rides in, same as she'll be standing here after. It was the first time Naomi had heard her new name spoken aloud in full, and she felt the weight of it, not romance but armor, offered in the middle of a dispute over fence posts and water rights. She met Slade's gaze without flinching. Mr. Slade, she said evenly, if you've cattle wandering onto Boone land, I expect you'll want them fetched before the inspector mistakes them for ours. Something flickered in Slade's expression. Surprise, maybe, that she'd speak at all, and irritation that she'd spoken well. Careful, Mrs. Boone. This is rough country for a woman who talks back. I've lived in rougher, Mr. Slade, and outlasted men who thought talking back was a woman's greatest sin. Naomi held his gaze steady until he looked away first. He touched his hat again, wheeled his horse, and rode off without another word. Silas watched him go, jaw tight. He'll try something worse than a fence. Let him try. Naomi's voice didn't waver, though her hands, hidden in her shawl, had curled tight. I didn't survive Abilene to be frightened off by a man on a big horse with a grudge over water rights. You don't know Slade. No, she agreed, but I know men like him. They test what pushes back before they decide how hard to push. Then we'll be ready for something worse than a fence, Naomi said. They spent the rest of the day resetting the posts, hauling new rail from the barn, working side by side in a rhythm that required no conversation. Pass, hold, drive, brace. By the time the light went gold and low, the fence stood again, imperfect but solid. Riding back to the house, Silas glanced at her, something unreadable in his gray eyes. You didn't have to speak up back there. I didn't marry you to stand behind you, Mr. Boone. I married you to stand beside you. There's a difference. He said nothing more, But that night at supper he moved his chair a few inches closer to hers at the table, and neither of them remarked on it. 30 days remained. The fence was mended. Everett Slade had ridden off with a warning traded instead of a threat delivered. And Naomi understood, watching Silas's shoulders ease by degrees over the meal, that the true test of the claim had only just begun. The trip to Odell's mercantile had been Naomi's idea. She needed thread and lamp oil, but more than that, she understood something Silas hadn't yet said aloud. A wife who never showed her face in town gave the gossips more to invent than one who stood plainly in front of them. The bell above the door rang sharp as they entered. Conversation didn't stop exactly. It just changed key, dropping into the register reserved for talk not meant to be overheard, and yet meant to be heard all the same. Behind the counter, a stout gray-haired woman with sharp eyes took Naomi's measure in a single glance. "You'll be the one Boone married." "Naomi Boone," she said, offering nothing more, asking nothing less. "Mrs. Odell." The woman's tone gave away nothing. She turned to fetch the thread Naomi asked for, movements brisk and businesslike. It was another customer, a thin woman in a fine wool coat, who spoke louder than she needed to from the far side of the store. "Seems awful quick, a man remarrying not even a year gone. Some folks don't take proper time to grieve." Silas's shoulders went rigid. Naomi laid a hand lightly on his arm before he could speak, and answered instead, her voice calm and carrying. "Grief doesn't run on any clock I've ever heard of, ma'am. Mine didn't. I expect Mr. Boone's followed its own path same as mine did." She let the silence stretch a beat. "I'll be along most weeks for supplies. You'll find me easy enough to talk to, if talk is what's wanted." The woman's mouth pressed into a thin line, but she offered nothing further. Mrs. Odell, ringing up the thread, allowed the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but something closer to respect. "Delphine Carr's been running her tongue since her own husband lost the Fenwick lease to Boone Land 2 winters back," Mrs. Odell said, low enough for only Naomi to hear. "Pay her no mind. She's got more grudges than good sense." "I've met her kind before," Naomi said. "They lose their sting once you stop flinching." "Well," Mrs. Odell measured out the calico with brisk, economical movements. "You didn't flinch. I'll say that much for you, Mrs. Boone, whatever else this town decides to say." "Add a length of the blue calico," Naomi said, "and a spool of black thread besides." She was already thinking of curtains for the kitchen window, something to soften the bare glass without erasing what had hung there before. Silas paid without comment on the total, though Naomi saw him note it. A man watching every dollar with the land office 30 days off and creditors circling. When they stepped back out into the street, he exhaled long, as if he'd been holding his breath since they walked in. "You didn't need to fight my battles in there," he said. "Wasn't fighting yours, fighting my own. Same battle, is all." Naomi adjusted the parcel under her arm. "People decide what to believe about a stranger fast. I'd rather they decide it looking at me than talking behind my back." Silas studied her, something working behind his eyes that he didn't put into words. Instead, as they crossed the rutted street toward the wagon, he set his hand lightly at the small of her back. Not possessive, not showy, just steady, guiding her around a frozen wheel rut she hadn't seen. It was such a small thing. It was also, Naomi understood, the first gesture he'd offered her in full view of the town, where any watching eye could make of it what it liked. They were nearly to the wagon when Mrs. Odell came out onto the porch of the mercantile, calling after them. "Mrs. Boone," Naomi turned. The older woman's face was unreadable, arms crossed against the cold. You handled Delphine Carr better than most would have. That woman's tongue has run half the wives out of this town in tears. A pause. I'll expect you back Thursday. I've a new bolt of wool coming in you might want first look at. It was not friendship. It was an opening. The smallest crack in a door that had been shut to Naomi since she'd stepped off the stage. She took it for what it was worth. Thursday, then, Naomi said. On the ride home, the wind bit sharp, but the silence between them had changed shape. Less a wall now, more a shared breath. Silas broke it only once, near the ranch gate. Delphine Carr's husband owes money to half the county, including me. She'll find something else to talk about soon enough. Let her talk, Naomi said. I've been talked about before. I'm still standing. Silas glanced at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Tongue River, something like the beginning of a smile touched the hard line of his mouth. The scream of a horse woke them both before dawn. Silas was out the door before Naomi had her boots laced, and she followed with a lantern, her breath fogging in the black cold. In the near pasture, one of the young geldings thrashed against a tangle of fresh-cut wire. A gash opened along its foreleg, blood dark against the frozen ground. Easy, Naomi said, moving toward the animal with slow, deliberate steps, her voice pitched low the way her husband Elias had taught her years ago, gentling a spooked mare in his forge yard. Easy now. The horse's eyes rolled white, but her steadiness reached him where panic could not. She got a hand on his neck, then his halter, holding him still while Silas cut the last of the wire free. This ain't fallen fence, Silas said grimly, examining the cut ends. This was clipped, fresh. Naomi knelt by the gelding's leg, pressing her shawl hard against the wound to slow the bleeding. I've dressed worse than this. Fetch the salve and clean cloth. I saw a tin in the tack room. He didn't argue. He went and came back fast and knelt across from her in the frozen mud, holding the lantern steady while she worked. Her hands were sure despite the cold, cleaning the wound, packing it, binding it tight enough to hold but not to choke the vein. You've done this before, Silas said, watching her. Elias shod horses for half of Dickinson County. I learned to patch what the shoeing sometimes tore. She tied off the last wrap and sat back on her heels. He'll limp a few days. He'll live. By the time the sun came up gray over the ridge, Jesse Boone had ridden in from his own cabin a mile off, summoned by the commotion. He looked at the wire, the wound, the fence line running straight toward Slade land, and his young face hardened in a way that made him look, for a moment, exactly like his older brother. Slade did this. We don't know that, Silas said, though his voice carried no real doubt. We know enough. Jesse crouched by the cut wire, turning a clipped end over in his fingers. This is new wire, Silas. You didn't buy new wire this season. The bank wouldn't let you. Could have come off any spool in the territory, Silas said, though he didn't sound as if he believed it himself. Could have, Jesse allowed. But I was at Odell's Tuesday when Slade's foreman's boy bought 2 full coils of this same gauge. Paid cash, which is a thing I noticed on account of Slade hasn't paid cash for anything since the fall roundup. He tossed the clipped end onto the ground. I didn't think much of it then. I think plenty of it now. Naomi watched the brothers, understanding the shape of what wasn't being said. That whoever had done this had money enough to spare fencing wire as a message, and nerve enough to leave the evidence in plain sight, confident no one could prove a thing. The inspector comes in 3 weeks, Naomi said quietly. If our stock's found scattered on Slade's land when he rides out here, what does that look like on paper? Silas's eyes met hers, and she saw the same calculation reflected there. Looks like a claim that can't hold its own fences. Looks like grounds to question everything else about it, too. Then we ride the whole line today, Jessie said. Every post, every strand. I'll fetch Ezra Dunmore from town. Man's handy with wire, and doesn't talk much besides. They spent the day repairing not just the break, but reinforcing every weak stretch of fence on the western boundary, 3 of them working through the cold without complaint. Naomi hauled rail alongside the men, her hands blistering inside her gloves, and when Jessie finally straightened at midday to stretch his back, he looked at her with open, unguarded respect. Silas is lucky, he said simply, whatever the reason he married you. It was not romance. It was recognition, plain and earned, and Naomi found she valued it more than any softer compliment could have given her. That evening, exhausted, the 3 of them ate a quiet supper together, the gelding resting easier in the barn, the fence standing whole again for now. He'll try something else, Silas said finally, into the quiet. Let him, Naomi said, echoing herself from days before, though her voice carried more weariness now than defiance. We'll be standing here when he does. Silas reached across the table, not for her hand exactly, but close enough that his fingers brushed hers over the worn wood. Neither of them moved away. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the cold promise of the winter still to come. And somewhere beyond the western fence line, a man who had underestimated them both was already planning his next move. The stranger arrived on the noon stage, and Naomi knew him before he ever said a word. Knew him by the particular way he stood, hat tipped just so, the practiced patience of a man paid to collect debts and skilled at waiting people out. She was at Odell's when she saw him through the window, speaking with the station agent, and her whole body went cold in a way the Montana wind hadn't managed. Ma'am. Mrs. Odell's voice cut through her stillness. You've gone pale as milk. I know that man, Naomi said quietly. Or I know his kind. He works for Corliss Bank in Abilene. She did not tell Mrs. Odell the rest. That Elias had borrowed against his forge the year before he died, that the debt had outlived him, that the bank's agents had a habit of following widows who left town rather than let the matter rest. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that 300 miles and a new name might be enough. She said nothing to Silas that night. She told herself it was because nothing had come of it yet. No knock at the door, no formal claim laid against Tongue River Ranch. But the truth sat heavier than that excuse. She was afraid of what he'd think of her, 3 weeks into a marriage built on the thin promise of an honest bargain, if he learned she'd arrived carrying a debt she hadn't disclosed. The man's name, she learned 2 days later from Mrs. Odell, who made it her business to know most things in Miles City, was Garrett Voss, and he had been asking after a Mrs. Reeves, formerly of Abilene, Kansas. Anyone tell him where to find her? Naomi asked, keeping her voice even. Not from me, Mrs. Odell said, studying her with new sharpness. But this is a small town, Mrs. Boone, and you rode in on a stage same as he did. Someone will put the pieces together, if they haven't already. Does Mr. Boone know this man is asking after you? Mrs. Odell asked, not unkindly, though the question landed like a hand pressed flat against a bruise. Not yet. Naomi busied herself folding a length of cloth that didn't need folding. You'll want to be the one who tells him then, and not the stage station gossip. Men take news differently, depending which hand it comes from. Mrs. Odell said no more on the matter, but the warning settled into Naomi like a stone dropped in still water, rings spreading long after the surface looked calm again. That evening, Naomi was distracted through supper, answering Silas in short pieces, her eyes on the window more than on him. He noticed. He said nothing until the dishes were cleared and Jesse had ridden back to his own cabin, and then he set down the harness he'd been mending and looked at her directly. "Something's troubling you since Tuesday." "It's nothing that concerns the claim." "Everything concerns the claim right now, Naomi. That's the arrangement." His voice wasn't unkind, but it was firm, the voice of a man who had learned the cost of being blindsided. "If there's a storm coming, I'd rather see it before it's on top of us." She almost told him then. The words rose in her throat. Elias's debt, Garrett Voss, the fear that had chased her north. But pride, old and stubborn, closed her mouth instead. "It's a private matter, from before. I'll handle it myself." Something shuddered in his expression. Not anger, but a retreat. The same wall she'd first met at his door weeks ago. "Suit yourself," he said, and picked the harness back up, and the silence between them that night was colder than it had been since her first evening in this house. She lay awake long after the lamp was out, listening to the wind test the shutters, thinking of Garrett Voss's patient face at the stage station, and of Silas's retreating one at the table. She had married this man for protection against exactly this kind of trouble, and now, faced with it, she had chosen silence over trust, the very thing she'd asked of him that first morning over Charlotte's apron, and failed now to offer in return. By the gray hour before dawn, she had made her decision. Whatever it cost her, whatever judgment came, a marriage built on hidden debts was no sturdier than the one built on hidden grief that this house had already survived once. She would tell him. Not because the land office required it of her, but because she had begun somewhere in these last weeks of fences and cold mornings and small unspoken kindnesses to want him to know her, the whole of her, debt and all. She rose before he did, put coffee on, and waited at the table for the sound of his boots on the stairs, rehearsing. For the first time in a long while, the plain truth. Silas came down to find her already seated, hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from. He read something in her face and sat across from her without a word, waiting. "There's a man in town," Naomi began, "named Garrett Voss. He works for a bank in Abilene." She made herself keep her eyes on Silas's, though every old instinct told her to look away. "My husband Elias borrowed against his forge the year before he died. I didn't know the full weight of it until after he was buried. The bank came looking for payment I couldn't make. I left Abilene owing more than I could ever hope to earn there, and I let this town, let you, believe I came here with nothing but empty hands and a will to work. I should have told you before the vows were signed." She braced for his anger, or worse, his disappointment, the particular coldness she'd seen flicker across his face the night before. Instead, Silas was quiet a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "How much?" "Near $200, with what's accrued." He exhaled, not in dismay, but in something closer to grim understanding. "That's not nothing. But it's not the reason I'm angry, if I'm angry at all." He looked up at her. "I'm angry you thought you had to carry it alone, 3 weeks into living under my roof. I've been carrying things alone a long time, Silas. It's a hard habit to break." "I know something about that habit myself." His voice roughened, Man doesn't grieve a wife and a stillborn son without learning to wall a few things off. He reached across the table, not taking her hand exactly, but resting his own beside it, close enough that their fingers touched. But if this marriage is going to hold, on paper or otherwise, we can't be two people guarding separate debts under one roof. Your trouble is my trouble now. That's what I meant. That first night, though I said it badly. Naomi felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since Abilene. Voss will want to speak with you, likely, or with the county, to see if my remarriage changes what he can claim. Let him ask. A debt taken on by a dead man against his own forge doesn't reach a wife's new husband's cattle, and any lawyer in this county will tell him so plain. He's here to frighten you into paying something you were never obligated for outright. That's a debt collector's oldest trick. Silas's jaw set. The same hardness she'd seen turned on Everett Slade. He comes to this house, he'll find both of us standing in that doorway, not just you. It was not a declaration of love. It was, Naomi understood, something she trusted more. A plain accounting of where he stood, offered without flourish, the same way he'd offered her his name that first cold evening. What will you tell him when you ride in? Naomi asked. That the forge debt belonged to a dead man's business, not to the woman he left behind, and Montana law backs that up whether Kansas likes it or not. That Voss can write his bank whatever he pleases, but he'll find no money and no wife willing to be frightened into paying a debt she doesn't legally owe. Silas's voice was even, almost bored, the tone of a man reciting facts rather than making threats. And if he pushes past that, he'll find I've got a lawyer in Miles City who owes me a favor from a fence dispute 2 years back. You've thought this through already. Thought on it the moment you said the name Corliss Bank. Man doesn't run a ranch on the edge of ruin without learning which debts have teeth and which ones are just noise meant to scare a body into paying. He allowed himself something close to a dry smile. Voss is noise, Naomi. Loud noise, maybe, but noise. Thank you, she said quietly, for not asking me to be grateful for it. Wasn't offering charity, offering what a husband owes. He held her gaze a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them that neither one yet had words for. Then he rose, fetched his coat. I'll ride into town today, speak to Voss myself. Best he hears the truth of the matter from Tongue River's owner, not from gossip at the Elkhorn. Naomi caught his sleeve before he reached the door. Silas. He turned. I wasn't only protecting my pride, keeping it from you. I was afraid of what you'd think, marrying a woman who came to you, already in debt to 2 men, one living, one dead. His expression gentled, the hard lines of his face easing in a way she had only glimpsed before, in stolen moments over a mended fence or a bound wound. I think, he said slowly, that a woman brave enough to tell me the truth after a night of deciding not to is worth a good deal more than the $200 Voss thinks he's owed. He left for town within the hour. Naomi stood at the window and watched him ride the frozen road until he was a small, dark shape against the white distance, and understood, with a clarity that startled her, that the wall she had built around her own heart since Elias's death had begun, this morning, to come down. Not because Silas Boone had torn it away, but because he had simply waited, patient and steady, for her to open the gate herself. Garrett Voss left Miles City 3 days later, satisfied, or defeated, Naomi could not tell which, after a conversation with Silas that Silas never fully recounted, save to say Voss would not be troubling either of them again. There was no time to dwell on the victory. The land office inspector was due within the week, And Everett Slade, Naomi was certain, would not let the opportunity pass quietly. She was right. The inspector, a narrow, precise man named Aldous Firth, arrived on a gray morning with a leather satchel of forms and an expression that gave away nothing. He walked the property in silence, noting the mended fence, the tidy barn, the smoke rising steady from the chimney. He asked pointed questions. How long had Mrs. Boone resided at the property? Was the marriage recorded properly with the county clerk? Did the household maintain itself without outside support? Naomi answered plainly, without embellishment, exactly as she had learned to do since arriving at Tongue River. She showed him the account book she'd kept since her first week. Every dollar spent, every repair logged, dated in her own careful hand. She showed him the mended fence line, the salved leg of the gelding still healing in the barn, the letter from Judge Harmon confirming the vows recorded proper with the county clerk. "Thorough," Firth said, making a note. "Most claims I inspect, the wife can't tell me what was spent on seed versus what went to the bank. I kept books for my first husband's forge 11 years, Naomi said. Habits like that don't leave a person just because the roof changed." Firth's pen paused over that answer longer than the others, though he said nothing more on it. It was his final question, delivered without warning as they stood in the kitchen. That caught her off guard. "Some in town suggest this marriage was arranged solely to satisfy the residency clause, Mrs. Boone. Is there truth to that?" The kitchen went still. Naomi felt Silas beside her, the tension coiled in his shoulders, and she understood in that instant that whatever they said next would decide more than the claim. "There's truth in how it began, Mr. Firth," Naomi said, before Silas could speak. "I answered an advertisement for a housekeeper's position. Mr. Boone offered marriage instead, plainly, for the reasons your office requires. A family able to hold this land. I won't pretend otherwise to you or anyone else." She felt Silas go rigid beside her, uncertain where her honesty was leading. "But I've mended his fences, nursed his stock, stood beside him against a neighbor determined to see this claim fail, and told him the truth about my own troubles when it would have been easier to hide them. Whatever this marriage was on the day it started, Mr. Firth, it isn't only that anymore." Silas's hand found hers, quiet and sure, on the table between them. "She's right," he said, his voice rough. "I asked her to marry me for the claim. I didn't expect what came after." He looked at Naomi, not at the inspector. "But it came after, all the same." Firth studied them both for a long moment, his pen hovering over the form. Outside, the sound of a horse approaching drew all their attention. Everett Slade, dismounting near the porch with the easy confidence of a man expecting to be proven right. "Mr. Firth," Slade called, striding up without invitation. "Before you sign anything, you'll want to hear what half this county already knows. That marriage was arranged inside a week, for no reason but the deadline on this claim. Ask anyone at the Elkhorn." Firth turned, unhurried. "I've asked, Mr. Slade. I've also noted the freshly cut fence wire your foreman's boy was seen purchasing at Odell's Mercantile 3 weeks past. The same wire found cut on the Boone property boundary, according to Mrs. Odell's ledger and Mr. Dunmore's account of the repair." He closed his satchel with a quiet snap. "I make it my business to gather more than gossip before I file a report, Mr. Slade. I'd advise you do the same before you ride out here again to influence a federal inspection." Slade's face went through several colors before settling on a controlled fury. "This isn't finished, Boone. It is for today. Silas said evenly. Slade wheeled and rode off without another word. Firth turned back to the couple still standing hand in hand at the table, something almost like approval in his sharp eyes. I'll file my report recommending the claim proceed to patent, pending final review, he said. For what it's worth, Mrs. Boone, I've seen a good number of arranged marriages in this territory made for far worse reasons than yours, and held together by far less honesty than what I witnessed here today. When he had gone, Naomi turned to Silas, her hand still caught in his. You didn't have to say what you said, about not expecting what came after. Wasn't saying it for Firth's benefit, Silas said quietly. Been meaning to say it to you a while now. Just took a stranger with a satchel to make me say it out loud. Outside, the first hard flurries of the season began drifting down past the window, and neither of them moved to build up the fire just yet. The storm came 3 days later, faster and harder than anyone in Miles City had predicted, the first true blow of what old-timers would come to call the worst winter the territory had ever seen. Silas rode out at first light to bring in the cattle from the low pasture near the frozen creek, promising to be back well before the weather turned. By mid-afternoon, the wind had risen to a scream, and he had not returned. Naomi stood at the window until she could no longer see past the porch rail, snow driving sideways in white sheets, and made her decision before fear could talk her out of it. She wrapped herself in every layer the house held, took the lantern and a coil of rope, and went out into the storm after him, over Jesse's shouted objections as he arrived to check on them both. I'm not asking you to come, she told him, already moving toward the barn. I'm telling you, I'm going. They found Silas's horse first, riderless, half buried near the creek bend, and Naomi's heart dropped through the frozen ground beneath her feet. It was Jesse who spotted the dark shape further on, half covered by drifting snow against the bank where the ice had given way beneath him. Silas was alive, but barely, a gash torn along his side where he'd fallen against broken ice, his skin gone the color of the snow around him. Naomi tore off her own outer coat and pressed it to the wound while Jesse worked to free him from the drift, both of them fighting the wind that seemed determined to bury the truth of what was happening out here on the frozen creek bank. Stay with me, Naomi said, close to his ear, her voice the only steady thing in the roaring white. Silas, stay with me. His eyes opened, unfocused, then found her face. Naomi. His voice was barely a breath. Shouldn't have come out here. Told you once already I wasn't asking permission. She pressed her sleeve harder against the wound at his side, willing the bleeding to slow through sheer refusal. Jesse, how far to the house from here? Half mile, maybe less, straight through. Jesse's voice was tight with effort as he worked the sled beneath his brother's weight. We'll not make it carrying him. Have to drag him and pray the ice holds where we're standing. Then we drag him. Naomi took up her end of the rope without waiting for agreement. Silas's eyes drifted, fighting to stay with them. Cattle, he rasped. Got most of them turned back before. I don't care about the cattle. Her voice broke on the words, raw honesty stripped bare by fear. I care about you. Do you hear me? I care about you, Silas Boone, and I am not dragging you out of this creek to lose you to a fever in your own bed. Something in his cracked, frost-bitten face shifted, even through the pain. Say that again, when we're someplace warm. I will, she promised. Now hold on to me. Between them, she and Jesse hauled him onto the sled Jesse had thought to bring, and the three of them fought their way back through the white blindness to the house. Every step a battle against a wind that wanted to claim them all. By the time they reached the door, Naomi's hands had gone past feeling, and still she did not let go of the rope binding Silas steady against the cold. Inside she worked through the night, cleaning the wound, packing it, forcing warm broth past his cracked lips, refusing to let the fever that crept in by midnight win any ground she could still fight for. Jessie rode for the doctor despite the storm, and did not return until near dawn, the physician half frozen himself but alive and capable. It was near daybreak, the fever finally breaking under the doctor's care, that Silas's eyes opened clear for the first time since the creek bank, and found Naomi still seated at his side, exhausted, her hand wrapped around his. "You came after me," he said, voice thin but steady now. "Told you I would, if it ever came to that." She pressed her lips briefly to his knuckles, too tired and too raw for anything more composed. "The only place safe enough for either of us anymore is beside the other one, Silas. I understood that out on the ice, if I hadn't fully understood it before." His hand tightened weakly around hers. "Said something like that to you myself, first night you came to this door. Didn't know then how true it'd turn out to be." "Rest," Naomi said, though her own eyes were bright with unshed tears. "There'll be time enough for the rest of it, once you're strong." Outside, the storm had begun, at last, to ease though the worst of the winter's toll, on the herds, on the county, on every rancher fighting to survive it, was only beginning to be counted. But inside the house on Tongue River, something had been settled that no blizzard could undo. Silas mended slowly through the hardest weeks of the big die-up, the winter that would be remembered across the territory for the cattle lost in staggering numbers, fortunes wiped out overnight, ranches abandoned to the bank. Tongue River lost stock, too. Fewer than most, thanks to Silas's efforts before the storm and Jessie's steady management after. But it did not lose the claim. The letter from the Custer County Land Office arrived in early March, official and final. The homestead patent was approved, the 640 acres theirs outright, free of any further review. Tucked inside the same delivery was a second document Aldous Firth had apparently seen fit to forward along, a signed statement from a mercantile clerk and a fence contractor, corroborating the purchase of wire traced to Slade Cattle Company, submitted to the county sheriff as evidence of deliberate property damage. Everett Slade would spend the spring answering for it in court, rather than expanding his grazing rights along the Tongue River. Naomi read both documents twice at the kitchen table before setting them down, her hand finding Silas's without needing to look for it anymore. An instinct now, worn smooth by the winter they'd survived together. "It's ours," she said. "Truly ours." "Was yours the day you signed your name to it," Silas said. "Land Office just took its time catching up to the truth of it." She rose and crossed to the shelf where Charlotte's apron still hung, untouched these long months, and beside it now the framed patent Silas had asked her to hang there herself. Naomi had not moved the apron. She had only made room beside it, the way she had made room for Charlotte's memory in every corner of this house since the first morning she'd stood here, uncertain of her welcome. "I used to think holding on to her things meant I hadn't fully let you in," Silas said, watching her. "Jessie said something to me a while back that stuck. Said grief doesn't take up less room just because you love someone new. Just makes more room around it." He's not wrong. Naomi came back to the table, sat beside him. "I think of Elias still. Some mornings more than others. It doesn't take anything away from what's grown here between us." Jessie arrived that afternoon with news of his own. Everett Slade had sold off half his herd at a loss, and put the Slade Cattle Company lease up for transfer, unwilling to face the county court over the fence charges come spring. "Man's leaving the territory before the circuit judge gets here," Jesse said, not troubling to hide his satisfaction. "Word at the Elkhorn is he won't show his face in Miles City again." "Good riddance to him," Naomi said, "and good fortune to whoever buys that stretch of river next, so long as they mend their own fences instead of cutting ours." Silas almost laughed at that. A rare, rough sound Naomi had come to treasure more than any softer courtesy he might have offered instead. Silas reached for her hand across the worn wood of the table, the same table where he'd first told her, bluntly, that the only thing he had to offer a stranger was his name and a claim to stand behind it. "I meant to ask you something, out on the creek, before the fever took the words from me." "Ask it now." "Marry me again," he said. "Not for the county this time, not for any deadline. Just for us, saying it plain, meaning every word of it." Naomi felt her throat tighten, the same fierce warmth she'd carried out into the blizzard after him rising now in the quiet of an ordinary morning. "I already gave you my answer once, on the worst night either of us has lived through. I'll give it to you again every morning you ask, for as long as you care to keep asking." They were married again in April, once the last of the snow had thinned from the fields, standing on the porch of the house they had fought to keep. No church, no crowd beyond Jessie and Mrs. Odell, and a handful of neighbors who had come, in the end, to respect what winter had proven about them both. There was no cottonwood tree, no borrowed finery. Only two people who had built something honest out of a bargain, and a town slowly learning to call it by its rightful name. Standing on that porch, Silas's hand in hers, the ranch stretching green and thawing behind them toward the river, Naomi understood at last the truth in the words he'd spoken that very first night, back when they were nothing more to each other than a debt and a deadline. The only place safe enough for either of them, in the end, had never been about land or a claim or a name on a piece of paper. It had only ever been about this, standing beside someone willing to stay.
That's the story of Naomi and Silas Boone, and the winter that nearly broke them before it proved exactly what they were made of. Theirs wasn't a love that erased what came before it. Elias, Charlotte, the depth and the rift they each carry north and west across harsh country. It was a love that made from for much room for all of it, and real steady anyway. If this story found you somewhere quiet tonight, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far this Perry story traveled to reach you. And if you like to ride along for more Wild West love story like this one, stay close, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. There's another story waiting just down the trail.